I want to thank you very much for bringing me out here from Jerusalem. First of all, the weather is better here than in Israel, amazingly. But secondly, you've really taken wonderful care of me and provided for all my needs, including kosher food. I appreciate that. I want to thank Volker, Barbara, Marcus, Tina, and all the wonderful people who worked very hard to get me here. And I want to thank the church for caring so much. And I know that you care about many people and many situations, but I experience it more in terms of the workshops that we've had now for 2 years, and we hope a third year soon, this spring, in Jerusalem or in Bet Jala. And if you're interested in hearing more about that, we'll talk about it over lunch. And I'm also looking forward to seeing my friend and colleague, Johanna, who is coming, I think right now, is probably in the Frankfurt airport, and we will see him soon. I know that this is a very difficult time for the world in general, and I would say for Western Europeans in particular, because of the terrible events of last week in Paris, but also yesterday in Hamburg, the attempt to, again, stifle freedom of expression. And I know that you're very aware of the need to walk a thin line. On the one hand, to completely reject and condemn any kind of violence against innocent people. And on the other hand, not to let this rage spill over into a negative approach to immigrants, a negative approach to people of a particular ethnic or religious background. And I personally always mention anti-Semitism and Islamophobia together as what someone has called evil twins. And these are phenomena that we want to reject, as I say, but again, at the same time, ensure a safe, secure society. So it's a very difficult balancing act. I think you do it well. And I want to say, if you were probably too busy yesterday, but I had a few minutes where I saw on the television an amazing story that in the kosher supermarket in Paris, there was a young man from Mali, and I assume that he's Muslim, an immigrant working in the store, who took some of the Jewish customers in the back and opened up the cold room where they refrigerate things and hid them, and therefore saved their lives. And I think that here again is a wonderful story of a human being, and our recent past together is full of terrible stories, but also wonderful stories. Here's a story of what we call in Hebrew, Chasidu Mot HaOlam, a righteous human being who risked his own life and saved the lives of others. So when I was invited to come today, originally the theme was presented to me as images of God. Don't worry, I'm also relating to Wie Gott zur Welt kommt. Did I say that correctly? It's kind of a Yiddish accent, but anyway, I understood how God comes into the world. How do we come to know God in the world? But when it was presented as images of God, I had a thought that there are 3 ways to approach this. The first one, human beings created in the divine image. And you know the work of Emmanuel Levinas, the 20th century Jewish philosopher in France, who said that we see God in the face of the other. The second association that I had was images of God graven images, one of the Ten Commandments. And here I think sometimes there are disputes between Jewish and Christian interpretations and understandings of that commandment, and we'll get into that a little bit. The third understanding, what images do we hold of God? Even if we don't make a graven image, what do we think about how God comes into the world? Where do we see God in the world? And here I'm going to go back to the first point. I think we see God through human beings. God comes into the world through the actions of human beings. And I gave one example of this immigrant from Mali, but I think there are daily examples of God's presence felt in the world through human action. And I think that your church is a wonderful example of that. So let's turn, you have a few pages that we gave out, but there is one page that has some biblical texts. That's this. I hope you have it. And you see, and in the interest of time, we're not going to read all the texts, but they're very familiar to all of us because really they're from the very beginning of our shared scripture, Genesis. So you have a number of references to B'Tsalmenu Kidmutenu, after our likeness, in our image. God created human beings in God's likeness. So what does that mean? Well, there have been many Jewish interpretations of what that means. Some of them focus on what we might call the intellectual interpretation. In other words, human beings have understanding, discernment. We have reason. And that's what it means to be in God's image, to be able to use our cognitive faculties to make decisions, reasoned decisions. But, interestingly, there's another approach that focuses not so much on the intellect as on the will, on choices that we make, which are colored, of course, by rational considerations, but sometimes also emotions, and emotional and spiritual responses. We do not behave so much instinctively. I know sometimes we talk about human instinct and so on, but we can overcome our instincts, whereas the rest of the animal world are very much in the throes of the influence of their instincts. We have choices. We have a will. We make decisions. And in so doing, according to Jewish tradition, we become part of a chain of eternity. So that's pretty much how Jewish commentators have understood these verses. And I just want to point out one more thing because I want to quote from a German Jewish philosopher of the 20th century. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the works of Leo Beck. And when you see in the second biblical passage here, the book of the generations of Adam, Sefer Toldot HaAdam. So Leo Beck said a very interesting thing, I think. He said, when it comes to having offspring, reproduction, parents and children, if you like, so all animals have that. There's nothing unique about humans having children. What is unique is humans having grandchildren. In other words, other species, they don't have the Toldot HaAdam. They don't have the generations. They don't have this link between grandparents, parents, and children. And I think that's a very special thing. And someone I know has used this quotation. And when his daughter had her first child, he said to her, "Thank you for making me human." Because only humans have grandchildren. So thank you for that. Okay. I will call your attention, though, to the next text, not the Exodus. We'll skip that and come back to it. The text that begins, "Therefore but a single person." Do you all have that? Yeah? It's probably at the bottom of the page. Yes? Okay. So I'm going to read that text because I think it's a very important text. It's not biblical, it's post-biblical. It's from the Mishnah, the major Jewish commentary on the Torah that was edited or compiled at the end of the 2nd century. And this text says, "Therefore but a single person was created in the world, to teach that if anyone has caused a single soul to perish, Scripture imputes it to him as though he had caused a whole world to perish. And if anyone saves a single soul, Scripture imputes it to him as though he had saved a whole world. Again, but a single person was created for the sake of peace among humankind, that none should say to his fellow, 'My father was greater than your father.'" Why? Because we all have the same one. "Again, but a single person was created to proclaim the greatness of the Holy One. Blessed is he. For people stamp many coins with one seal, and they are all like one another. But the King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed is he, has stamped every person with the seal of the first human being, Adam. Yet none of them is like his fellow. Therefore everyone must say, 'For my sake was the world created.'" So I want to just point out there, first of all, you may have heard versions of this that include the word Israel. That if you save a soul of Israel, it's like you saved a whole world. Or if you perish a soul from Israel, that is a later addition. The earliest manuscripts are what I just read. And clearly the context has nothing to do with Israel. It's talking about the children of Adam, and that means human beings. The later emendation reflects certain historical conditions that I won't go into. There's been a lot of research done on that. So the original text that we have here is a universal text. It's not a particularistic text. The second thing I want to say is, I've heard people quote from the Quran similar texts. So it's a very universal text that can be used, and I hope would be used, by people of many faiths and many backgrounds. But now I want to look a little more closely at the text that you have in front of you. And I want to say that the first section about why the human being was created as one, Adam, and then of course Eve, has to do with the ultimate value of all human life. One person is like a whole world. The second section, where it says, "Nobody should say my father was greater than your father," that has to do with the equality of all human beings. We all come from the same father and mother. And finally, the third section, where it says that when you stamp a coin or a seal, they're all the same, but all of us who are stamped with the divine image, we're all different. That has to do with the uniqueness and individuality of all human beings. Now, there is a second understanding of images that has to do with the creation of graven images, you see from the Exodus text. I don't want to go into that so much because here there have been different interpretations over the ages between Jews and Christians, and even between Christians and Christians. Within Christian church history, you have the whole phenomenon of the iconoclasts who destroyed the icons. And I know that different churches have different interpretations. I would like to suggest that one way that this could be meaningful to us is a text that you have at the end of this sheet from Rav Kook, another 20th century Jewish philosopher, who basically is saying, anytime we try to define God, that's already heresy. That's already problematic. And the Hebrew word for define is lehagdir, which means really to build a fence around something, a gader. So when we try to define what the essence of God is, we're trying to take something that's infinite and put it into a very small box. And that's already problematic. So I'm not going to get into whether we should have representational art or not. We all have art, even Muslims who take this very, very strictly and have non-representational art, but they still have art. In fact, I know because we have a wonderful Islamic art museum in Jerusalem. So we all appreciate the aesthetics of religion, and we have different interpretations as to how much you can represent. But I want to focus now for the last 3 or 4 minutes on what can we say about God. Well, here, as you may know, there are at least 2 different approaches. There's one approach that says we can't really say anything at all. All we can say is what God isn't. You know, the via negativa. We can say God is not physical, God is not temporal, God is not this, not that. That was the approach that was very much in the work of Rambam, Maimonides, the great medieval Jewish philosopher. But I want to suggest another approach. In the Talmud, it says, what does it mean to walk in God's ways? It means to try to emulate God, and the Latin would be imitatio Dei. As God is compassionate, so we must be compassionate. As God is merciful, so we must be merciful. As God feeds the hungry and clothes the naked, so must we do those things. As God visits the sick and comforts the mourners and buries the dead, so we must do those things. So that is how God comes into the world, by human beings emulating those aspects of God. And I would simply call your attention to something on this sheet from my, unfortunately she died very young, my late friend Tikva Frimmer-Kensky, who was a 20th century, lived into the 21st century, Jewish feminist scholar, where she says imitation of God never prescribes behavior that takes advantage of power and dominion, but it always involves self-control, self-abnegation, and love. Finally, I call your attention to the other sheet. And here, I added this at the very last minute, I think, and I appreciate the fact that you got it ready in time. Something that I just became aware of in the last few days before I left for my flight to Frankfurt. A Catholic Frenchman, economist, bit of a social philosopher, Edouard Tétrault, has published a very, very important article. And one of the nice things is this article has been translated into a variety of languages, including Hebrew, but certainly German, English, and many, many other languages. And he points out a very dangerous phenomenon in our world called transhumanism. And I think this is a serious threat to the future of human beings. And I think that religious people should take it very seriously. We won't read the whole thing, but transhumanism would use technological innovations to enhance the body to the point that humans achieve immortality. And of course, the only people who are going to be able to do that are the ones who can afford to do that. And most human beings are not going to be able to afford to do that, so we're going to end up, God forbid, with a kind of double-tiered system of humanity where there will be the Übermenschen and the Untermenschen. And it's interesting that we use those words in German, I think, for obvious reasons. But I do personally feel that the German people and the German state have given the world a marvelous model of metanoia, of transformation. And you've become one of the important and serious democracies in our world. And I think that maybe in this area as well, we have to work together to enhance the ultimate value of every human life, every mortal human life, because God is immortal, but God works in the world through mortal human beings. Thank you.